Hey boys, we're ready for chapters 3 and 4 of Bud Not Buddy. And for chapters 3 and 4, you still need to be adding details about characters or settings to your notice and wonder chart. What are you noticing about the setting? What are you wondering about it? What are you noticing about the characters? What are you wondering about the characters? Chapter 3. So when we stopped chapter 2, or when we ended chapter 2, Bud had just been locked in the Amos's shed by Mr. Amos. He's really nervous because of all the scary stories Todd was telling him. He doesn't really believe them, but still, he's pretty spooked out. Okay. So, he's in the shed all by himself, and it's so dark. The only thing I could hear was my own breath. It was so loud that it sounded like there were 6 scared people locked up in the shed. I closed my eyes and I thought real hard about making my breathing slow down. Pretty soon, it sounded like the 5 other breathers in the shed had left. I was still scared, but now it was that get real excited and want to move around kind of scared. It didn't take too long for my eyes to get used to the dark. There was a gray gas can in one corner next to a bunch of gray rakes and a pile of gray rags and a gray tire next to some gray fishing poles. Maybe Mr. Amos only pretended to lock the door. I reached my hand toward the gray doorknob, and quick as I went from kind of calm to being in that stand in one splate, I reached out my hand toward the gray doorknob, and quick as that, I went from kind of calm to being in that stand in one place with spit drooling down the front of your shirt, kind of scared. Halfway up the door were 3 little flat monster heads guarding the doorknob. Each head had 2 little round eyes staring right at me. The eyes were the only thing in the shed that weren't gray. They were a bright yellow with a big black spot right in the middle. Ooh, which way am I going here? I dropped my blanket and pillow and backstepped until my legs hit the wood pile behind me. From all the fast breathing going on, you'd have thought the 5 other scared people had come back and brought a couple of their scared friends with them. Each head had a wide open mouth and a sharp set of pointy teeth and lips smiling back, ready to bite. It felt like the shed was getting smaller and smaller, and the little mouths were getting closer and closer. Then I knew what I was looking at. The doorknob guards were 3 dried out fish heads that someone nailed to the door. I ran over to the pile of rags and poked at one of them with my shoe just to make sure there weren't any rats or centipedes hiding under it. Then I picked it up and hung it over the fish head so I couldn't see them and they couldn't see me. I picked up my blanket and pillow and had to decide what was the best way to sleep. I knew the floor was no good. I'd bet all sorts of bugs and roaches were crawling around. I remember what happened to my best friend, Bugs, when a cockroach crawled in his ear one night at the home. 4 grown folks held Bugs down whilst they tried to pull it out with a pair of tweezers. But the only thing that did was pull the roach's back legs off. When they were digging around in Bug's ears with the tweezers, you would have thought they were pulling his legs off, not some cockroaches. I'd never heard a kid scream that loud. After about 15 minutes of Bugs screaming the joint down, they said they were going to have to take him to the emergency room to get the roach out. It was almost morning when Bugs got back. Everyone was asleep except me. I waited until they put him in bed and turned off the lights. I said, "Did they get it out?" He said, "Oh, hi, Bud. Yeah, they got him." "Did it hurt a lot?" "No." Were you scared? Nope. Then how come you were screaming so doggone loud? He said, I didn't know I was. I probably couldn't hear me screaming 'cause the roach was so loud. I'd seen lots of roaches, but I'd never heard one of them make any sound. I said, loud how? Well, bugs ain't so different from us, you'd think. Soon as he saw those tweezers coming at him, he was pretty terrified and commenced to scream, and screaming in English, too, not some bug language like you would expect from a roach. Yeah? What'd he say? All he kept yelling was, my legs, my legs! What have they done to my legs? That's the true story about how bugs started getting called bugs. I'd bet $1,000 there were some roaches on the floor of this shed. Just waiting to crawl in someone's ear. And I bet those Amoses wouldn't have even tried to pull the roach out. And who knows how long I'd have listened to some terrified roach screaming his head off right against my eardrum. I spread the blanket on top of the wood pile and climbed up on it. This put me so I was even with the window. I took a piece of bark and brushed all the spider webs from in front of the window. Then I put my hand on the glass to see if the newspaper was pasted from the inside or the outside. I touched paper. I spread my fingers, and my hand looked like a yellow jacket bumblebee, bright yellow with black stripes. This was a great place to have shadow puppets, so I made my hand into a wolf and a dog and a duck. After a while, that got pretty boring, so I scraped at the paper with my fingernails so I could see outside. But I like to keep my nails bit down real low so the paper didn't budge. I took out my jackknife and tried scraping the newspaper with it. The paper peeled away in little curly yellow strips, that stuff like rich people throw on New Year's Eve. I finally got a hole big enough to look out of and mashed my eye up against the glass. I could see the back of the Amos house real clean. There was a light on. That had to be Mr. and Mrs. Amos's bedroom. The little bit of light that came through the hole in the paper made me get calm enough that I could lay my head on my pillow and take a nap. When I blinked my eyes open, the first thing I noticed was that light from the Amos's bedroom was out. The next thing I noticed made me wish I'd stayed asleep. Up at the very top of the shed was the biggest vampire bat you'd ever see. He was hanging upside down asleep, but the smell of me rising up to him would probably wake him up any minute. I reached over to the window and tried to slide it open. It budged an inch. I rolled off the wood pile and crawled toward the door with the fish head guards. I reached my hand up, and the doorknob turned. Mr. Amos was trying to help me. But after the door opened a crack, the padlock and chain on the outside held it tight. I looked up. I looked back up into the rafters to see if the bat had woke up. He was still sound asleep. Just like there's a time when a smart person knows enough is enough, there's a time when you know you've got to fight. I wasn't about to let this vampire suck my blood dry without a war, and he could kiss my wrist if he thought that was going to happen. I got up off my knees and picked up the gray rake. I walked over to the wood pile, cool as a cucumber, but inside every part of my guts was shaking. I stood up on the wood pile and I held the rake like it was a Louisville slugger. I eyed where the bat was sleeping and I revved the rake like I was going to hit 100-foot home run. Just before I swung, I remembered another one of Bud Caldwell's rules and things for having a funner life and making a better liar out of yourself. Rules and things number 328. When you make your mind up to do something, hurry up and do it. If you wait, you might talk yourself out or of what you wanted in the first place. Shucks, I couldn't remember for sure if you killed the vampire by driving a stake through its heart or by shooting it with a silver bullet. If I was wrong and didn't kill the bat right away, I was going to be trapped in the shed with a vampire who was probably going to be real upset that somebody had woke him up by whacking him with a rake. I took my jackknife out of my pocket and pulled the blade open. That way, if I didn't kill him with a rake and it came down to the two of us tussling on the floor, maybe a silver blade in his heart would be just as good as a silver bullet. Unless that's what you had to do with werewolves. I raised the rake over my head and closed my eyes and swung it like I was Paul Bunyan chopping down a tree with one blow. I felt the rake jerk a little when it hit the bat, and I opened my eyes just in time to see the vampire get cut right in half. I was kind of surprised it didn't scream or cry or say, "Curses, you got me." Instead, the only sound I heard was a kind of a rattling, like a couple pieces of paper rubbing together, or like dry leaves blowing around in the wind. The next sound I heard was even worse than if the vampire had said, "Aha, you doggone kid, that hurt, but now I get my revenge." It sounded like I'd turned on a buzz saw in the shed. All of a sudden, it felt like someone had stuck a red hot nail right into my left cheek. My hand reached up to grab my cheek, and I felt something creepy and prickly there. I brought my hand back down, and it was holding the biggest, maddest hornet I'd ever seen. I squeezed my palm to crush it, but it got another sting in on my palm. What I thought was a vampire bed hanging on the ceiling was really a hornet's nest, and there were about 6,000 hornets flying around in the tiny shed. Each and every one of them was looking for me. Another fire nail went into my knee, and a second one went into my sock. Maybe this is why the other kid they'd found in here had been big as a whale. He was swollen up from all the hornet stings. I dropped my shoulder down and charged the door with all my might. The door banged against the lock, but it didn't budge an inch. All that happened was the rag I'd covered the fish heads with came off, and I got bounced back and landed on the floor. I jumped up again. This time, when I charged at the door, I put my hand out like Paul Robeson running down the football field. This wasn't a real good idea. I forgot all about the fish head door guards. My fingers went right into the mouth of the biggest one, and his little needle teeth cut me like a razor. I pulled my hand back and screamed. Another hornet buzzed into my ear, and it felt like someone had poured hot wax right down into my brain. The only thing I could do was the only thing I could think to do was jump on the wood pile and bust the glass out of the window. I grabbed the handles of the window and gave them one more jerk. I guess being scared gives you a lot of strength, because this time the window flew open with a loud bang. 3 hornets found me at the same time, and all 4 of us fell out the window. As soon as we hit the ground, I rolled as far away from the shed as I could go. I smacked and whacked the hornets that had taken a ride on me and just laid there until I could catch my breath. After a while, the stings and the fish guard bite quit hurting so much. I started getting madder and madder. I was mad at the Amoses, but most of all, I was mad at me for believing there really was a vampire in the shed, and for getting trapped in there like this when there wasn't anybody who cared what happened to me. I simmered down and started thinking about getting even. I wondered how hard I'd have to pull the trigger in that double barrel shotgun for it to go off. Sneaked up to the back porch steps to get inside the house. Maybe the vampire bat didn't say it, but the only thought on my mind was, "Aha, you doggone Amoses, that hurt, but I'll get my revenge." Don't forget to be adding things that you notice and wonder. Chapter 4. They hadn't locked the kitchen window. It slid open with just a couple of squeaks. Then I was inside the Amos house, crouched down like a cat burglar. Quick as a rabbit, I looked under the table to see if they'd moved my suitcase. It was still there. I got a whole lot calmer when I picked it up and it was the right weight. I didn't think they'd taken anything out of it. I couldn't be sure until I looked inside, but I could do that later. I took a deep breath and looked over at the icebox to see if the shotgun was still there. I let all the air out in a big puff when I saw it. Shucks. You'd think that with the Amoses being so doggone mean, they'd worry about leaving a big old gun like that out in the open. What if one of their visitors got real mad about at them at something? I unlocked the back door and set my suitcase on the first step of the porch so I could make a quick getaway after I was through paying these Amoses back. I opened the screen door real quick and went back into the house. Fair is fair. The Amoses deserved what they were going to get. I can't blame Todd. I can't all the way blame Todd for giving me trouble, though. If I had a regular home with a mother and father, I wouldn't be too happy about other kids living in my house either. Being unhappy about it is one thing, but torturing the kids who are there, even though they don't want to be, is another. It was my job to make sure other kids who didn't know where their mothers and fathers were didn't have to put up with Todd. My heart started jumping in my stomach as soon as I reached out for the shotgun. It was a lot longer and heavier than I thought it would be. I lifted it and felt how solid the smooth brown wood was against my shoulder. With it up close to my face like this, I could smell the gray metal of the barrel and the gun oil Mr. Amos used on it. I aimed the gun at the stove and pretended I was shooting an elephant or a dragon or a tiger, or best of all, Todd. I imagined how it would feel to creep up to his bed while he was sleeping and put the shotgun barrel right in his nose. After that, I'd have to do some quick moving to get the grown up Amoses. Unless they were real sound sleepers and the shotgun going off in Todd's room would give them a clue that something was going on. I lowered the gun. These things were just too dangerous to play with or take chances with. That's why the first part of my revenge plan was to get this gun out of the way. If something went wrong and the Amoses woke up, I didn't want them rushing down to the kitchen to get the gun. I knew they'd shoot me in a flash and tell the home it was an accident. I took the gun outside and put it on the back porch in a corner where they wouldn't be able to see it till daytime. I felt a lot better when it was out of my hands. When I was back in the kitchen, I started opening cupboards looking for the drinking glasses. The first one I opened had the jelly jar they'd given me to drink out of at supper time. I walked over to the sink and turned on one of the spigots. These Amoses had hot water running right into the house. I let it run for a second to warm up and put a dish rag in the bottom of the sink so the splashing wasn't too loud. When the water was good and hot, I stuck the jelly jar underneath until it was filled to the brim. I started down the hall. Todd's door came open easy as anything. I tiptoed over to his bed. He was deep asleep, and his hands were crossed on his chest like he was ready for the graveyard. I dipped my middle finger in the water. It felt like the perfect temperature. I held my breath and picked up one of Todd's chubby hands. One of the older boys at the home told me if you dip someone's hand in a warm glass of water whilst they're asleep, they don't have any choice but to pee the bed. It's something about chemistry and biology and making some valve in your guts open up and whoop, zoop, sloop, you've got a wet bed. I started to dip Todd's fingers in the water, but I couldn't dip more than 2 fingers at a time. Todd's bed stayed as dry as the desert. I tried holding Todd's hand flat and pouring the water over it, but it still didn't get wet, but he still didn't wet the bed. Finally, I just decided to just pour the water on his pajama pants. I pulled the blanket and sheet down and emptied the jar. His face twitched a couple of times, and for a minute it looked like his eyes were going to come open, but they stayed shut. He smiled, and the warm water from the jelly jar opened that little valve up, and whoop, zoop, sloop, he soaked his sheets. I tiptoed out of the room and down the hall and out the door. My favorite saying in the whole world is, "He who laughs last laughs best." So I put my hand over my mouth and whispered, "Ha ha ha." I picked up my suitcase and walked to the street. Man, I was on the lam. I was just like public enemy number one. If J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI saw me now, I would be in some serious hot water. So, my favorite part of that um, chapter is when Bud makes Todd pee the bed. I just love it when people get what they deserve. Todd was being a jerk. And, you know, he had made such a big deal about saying Bud was a bedwetter. And then he was the one who ended up wetting the bed.